Well, I want to echo the earlier comments about Burge first. I think he's one of the greats in this business, and it's been my pleasure to know him, not long enough, but hopefully that continues for quite a while. I'm going to sit if people don't mind. Commissioner Pai also has a long, distinguished career. He's most recently was a partner at the law firm Jenner & Block in Washington, D.C. He's held positions as Deputy General Counsel of the FCC, while I was also at the FCC, so I've had the privilege of working with him. He's been Associate General Counsel of Verizon Communications. He's worked at the Department of Justice. So he has a pretty broad grounding in the types of regulatory issues that are facing the 4G world today, including the spectrum issues that were just discussed in relation to Clearwire. Commissioner Pai was confirmed by the Senate and sworn in last May. And so he's only been at the FCC for a short time, but in that short time, I think he's made some very powerful statements. He's proposed reforms that are aimed at making the FCC more responsive to market innovation, which I think, given the introductory keynote we just received, should please everyone who's in this industry and in this room. He believes it's vital for the FCC to adopt policies that give private firms the strongest incentives to invest, raise capital, develop new products and services, and to compete in established and new markets, which are all of the things that this 4G world ecosystem we're involved in or are trying to do. So it's with greatest pleasure to introduce Commissioner Ajit Pai, and I'm so glad that he's been able to join us today through this wondrous thing of technology. I'm hoping that I've not only gone wireless, I've gone paperless. I'm hoping I don't run out of battery, but is he, well, there he is. Commissioner Pai, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well. And oh, I've got a monitor down here so I don't have to turn around. Great. Well, you weren't here for the previous keynote, but it was all about spectrum and the advantages that having a lot of spectrum could provide in terms of capacity, which is a perfect segue into my first question, which is all about the explosive growth in data traffic that we're experiencing in this community that's threatening to overwhelm the 4G networks. The National Broadband Plan recognized that this is an essential part of the solution to the data crunch, making more spectrum available, and the FCC plays a critical role in that. So I wanted to know what plans there are for making more spectrum available.
Oh, Fred, thank you for the question. And before I get to an answer, let me just thank you and 4G for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I apologize that I'm not able to be with you in person, but as was suggested, Hurricane Sandy threw a wrench in our travel plans. I'm also glad that you are not taking this opportunity to conduct a Clint Eastwood-style dialogue with my empty chair up on the stage. Now, when it comes to the spectrum issue, this is one of the most fundamental things that the FCC has to get right. As you know, the National Broadband Plan, which the FCC adopted in 2010, set forth ambitious goals with respect to spectrum. Specifically, it outlined a plan to get 300 megahertz of spectrum available for mobile broadband by 2015, and an additional 200 megahertz of spectrum for wireless broadband by 2020. I expressed repeatedly support for each of these goals. In particular, the goal of getting 180 megahertz of spectrum out into the commercial marketplace in 2012. My concern of late has been that we have not been on track to meet these goals. In fact, just last month, we, for the first time, put some points on the scoreboard, so to speak, when the FCC adopted an order making 20 megahertz of WCS spectrum available for mobile broadband, with the possibility of an additional 10 megahertz to be made available for fixed wireless broadband. So we're starting to make some progress, but we should and must do much more. Well, what more specifically? One of the things I've talked about, starting with my first major speech that I made in Pittsburgh this past July, is taking an all-of-the-above approach when it comes to spectrum. That means having a successful incentive auction with respect to the broadcast television spectrum. That means more unlicensed spectrum. It also means clearing and reallocating more federal spectrum. And finally, it also means getting more spectrum out in the commercial marketplace that is currently in the pipeline. Now, if we do these things and much more, I'm confident that we can solve our spectrum problems and alleviate any ostensible or actual spectrum crunch.
Thanks. You know, we talked a lot about the incentive auction that's upcoming with the broadcasters at the Spectrum Summit this morning, and some of the challenges that that auction entails and the complexity. I wondered if you had any insight into some of the challenges that are facing the FCC with this historic approach to making more spectrum available.
That's a great question. And by the way, I should apologize from the outset. I'm also laboring under a pretty severe cold. So if the coughs start echoing through the hall chamber, I hope you'll accept my apologies. The incentive auction, as you know, incorporates three basic elements: a reverse auction, in which the broadcast television licensees ideally would participate, the repacking process, and finally a forward auction, in which wireless providers would submit bids on cleared spectrum. Now, I think everyone would agree that any one of these components individually would be a challenge for the Commission to structure and for the industry to understand. But doing them all in conjunction, as the recent legislation, otherwise known as the Spectrum Act, requires, is going to be daunting indeed. So as the FCC undertakes the rulemaking process, which, as you know, started on September 28th when we adopted the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, we need to keep four basic principles in mind. First and foremost, we at the FCC have to be faithful to the terms of the statute. Congress set forth very detailed guidelines on what they expected the Commission to do, when, and how, and we are charged with administering that statute, as we are with any statute that Congress passes. So we need to stick to the letter of the law. Secondly, to the extent possible, we need to keep it simple. This process is going to be complicated enough as it is, and we at the agency should try to refrain from introducing any unnecessary complexities into the process. That will only serve to incentivize people from participating. Third, we have to be fair to all stakeholders, broadcast television licensees, to wireless broadband providers, to people who pass the law in Congress, and to many others who have a stake in this process. And last but not least, my view is that we should try to complete the proceeding no later than June 30th of 2014. And I certainly recognize that this is an ambitious deadline given the nature of the task, but the issues at stake are too important, and the spectrum needs are too acute for us to not set a deadline, because otherwise the very complexities of the process could serve as an excuse for delaying action.
In addition to the keeping it simple, which is always a good principle, I think, when it comes to regulatory matters, and the fairness, is there anything the FCC can do, maybe affirmatively, to try to encourage broadcasters to participate?
I think there is. We need the broadcasters to engage in robust participation, and for them to feel comfortable doing that, we have to reestablish a firm foundation of trust. And I think once we do that, you will see many more broadcasters indicating their willingness to participate in the process. So how do we do that? Well, I think there are a couple of things we can do beyond the sort of outreach that is already underway. For one thing, we need to take to heart the feedback that we receive from broadcasters in the context of the current rulemaking. We need to really carefully scrutinize their comments. We need to meet with them as extensively as we can to understand their perspective on the issues. We need to make sure that they know that we have heard what they have to say. Secondly, consistent with one of the earlier principles that I outlined, I think we have to keep it simple. For wireless broadband providers to participate in a spectrum auction is one thing. There is an established history there, and I think many people are comfortable with the process of valuation and bidding and so forth. But what I've heard from a number of broadcasters is that this is really starting from scratch for many of them. Not only do they not know how to participate in the reverse auction itself, the mechanics of it, but just basic things like valuation of the spectrum they hold is a very difficult question for them. What are the other options in terms of channel sharing or other ways for them to exercise their rights in the incentive auction? So keeping it simple will enable them to make better informed decisions sooner. Last but not least, I think we should make sure that we structure the auction in such a way that there are going to be sufficient funds for the Broadcaster Relocation Fund, because if that fund runs short, then that only makes the nationwide repacking process that much more difficult. So those are a few ideas that I have that I think would bring broadcasters to the table.
It sounds more challenging by the second, so I certainly think I'm glad we have you at the FCC to help get through this process. We also talked about.
You're very kind to say that.
Well, it's very true, but we talked at the Spectrum Summit about the fact that some of these funds are intended for a nationwide public safety network, and that the U.S. is committed to that in the 700 megahertz band. So I wanted to get your thoughts about whether there'll be enough money to fund that network, and whether there may be some commercial opportunities as well that result from the building of that network.
Well, I certainly hope so, and I think that Congress, when it passed the Spectrum Act, intended that to be the case. And my concern is that the primary proposal that was outlined in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking does not seem to envision the auction closing at a point where you would have sufficient funds for public safety broadband network, for next generation 911, and other purposes. So one of the things I do hope that commenters will illustrate for the Commission in the context of rulemaking is the right direction to go in order to obtain maximum revenues for the purposes of building a public safety broadband network. I think it's absolutely critical that we do so. Excuse me. Now, with respect to your second question about commercial opportunities, I think there are significant opportunities and, frankly, necessities for the commercial side to participate in this process. The Spectrum Act, for example, requires that FirstNet issue in an open and transparent way a request for proposals to the commercial sector to engage in the deployment process. And that's going to be very important. The Spectrum Act also goes on to say that FirstNet must leverage to the maximum extent possible the existing wireless infrastructure that is in place, so that we don't end up reinventing the wheel twice, so to speak. So I think there are significant commercial opportunities, and from an FCC perspective, I look forward to working with both sides, with FirstNet and with the commercial side, to make sure that we don't miss any chance to maximize the deployment of a public safety infrastructure.
Okay, I'm going to try to limit this to one more on this whole issue of the broadcast incentive auction and 700 megahertz and the like. One of the issues that came up at the Spectrum Summit earlier is there's some history with the 700 megahertz band, and this is sort of an extension of that. It's whether there's an intersection between the interference with broadcast issue in the 700 megahertz band with channel 51 and the band plan that's being considered in the incentive auction proceeding.
Yes, that is a significant concern, and I've heard extensively from both sides about it. And this is a policy problem that stems, I think, in the first instance, from a basic engineering problem. And that is that you have interference that is caused from the channel 51 broadcasters to those who occupy the 700 megahertz A block. And what results from this issue is in Chicago, where you're meeting today. So once the channel 51 interference problem goes away, the plus side is that the occupants of the B and C blocks have indicated that they would be willing to adopt a band plan that would be uniform across the 700 megahertz spectrum. So this interoperability problem would basically melt away, since you would, without the need for an FCC mandate and for the FCC to step into the middle of what is a very technical exchange between the two sides. Well, how do we solve that problem? How do we make the channel 51 interference problem go away? The incentive auction process is going to be critical to that. The end goal, of course, is to relocate the current occupants of channel 51 lower in the band so that it won't be that problem. Now, in the meantime, one of the things I proposed, and I was glad that my colleagues agreed to include it in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, was a proposal to allow voluntary agreements to happen between Channel 51 broadcasters and 700 megahertz license holders. That way, they can work out between themselves ways to perhaps relocate early instead of waiting for the actual date of the incentive auction to happen. And I'm optimistic that voluntary agreements among the parties might be able to solve the problem, or at least solve it a little bit sooner than the administrative process would.
Tom Hazlitt would be very pleased, for those who were at the Spectrum Summit earlier today, who talked about those types of issues. There's also the federal government issue. They hold a lot of the spectrum that is eligible for mobile 4G uses. Traditionally, the federal spectrum, the FCC and NTIA have had to get together and reallocate the federal spectrum for exclusive commercial use and then clear it. But the President's Council, I got to get this right, of Advisors on Science and Technology, which I know is PCAST, the easier version, recently recommended that going forward, federal spectrum should be shared with commercial users, and that clearing should no longer be the norm. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this recommendation and how it might impact the FCC.
That's a great question. Consistent with my all-of-the-above approach, I do support sharing, for example, the creation of geographic exclusion zones that can solve a problem in a way that is both administratively workable and technically feasible. My concern with the PCAST report, however, is that it seemed to take clearing spectrum off the table in favor of a sharing approach. And I think part of the reason why I was disappointed with this is that the report seems to consider only the costs and estimated timeframes that were submitted by the constituent federal agencies that had to report to the NTIA. So, for example, NTIA asked a variety of agencies, how long will it cost you and how long will it take for you to relocate your operations? Well, agencies having the natural incentives that they do, of course, the costs and the timeframes were very high, unduly high in my opinion. And so I think if our goal is to maximize the incentives for wireless, investing in wireless networks, nothing beats clearing. And why do I say that? Well, let me just give you an analogy to illustrate why. Let's say that you were looking to build a house and you needed to buy some land. The government comes to you and says, here are two options, option A and option B. Option A means that we will sell you the land and you can build the house as you see fit and enjoy its use. Option B is we will lend you the land for a time, but any house you build on it could be occupied by us from time to time without notice, and you won't have the unencumbered right to use that property. Now, I think it's pretty obvious under which option you would prefer to build a house. It would be option A because you would have the freedom to design a home, or in this context, design a network as you see fit. And so in order to maximize the incentive for the commercial side to deploy next generation networks using this spectrum, I think it's critical that we try to clear and reallocate spectrum in that manner. So my hope is that with the collaboration of the NTIA, with other parts of the federal government, leadership from the White House, and the participation of all of you on the commercial side, we can begin to move the ball in terms of federal spectrum.
Well, there's one piece of federal spectrum in particular that I know the NTIA addressed in those cost estimates. It's sought after by the industry because it would help internationally harmonize some of the AWS spectrum. There's a piece of the AWS spectrum on the upper end that's been allocated for mobile for some time, but it doesn't have a paired companion band. It's that federal band is 1755 to 1780. I wonder what if you had any views on what should be done about that band sharing versus clearing.
Well, my preference would be for clearing the lower 25 megahertz of the 1755 band. I think it's ideal for commercial broadband use. As you pointed out, it's internationally harmonized for use, and it also could be paired very well with AWS spectrum, 25 megahertz of which is available right now. And so my hope would be that we would clear that spectrum. And I think if we make it a priority, if we focus on that 25 megahertz of federal spectrum in particular, that we could get some progress on that piece before any others.
Okay, well let's move on to another type of spectrum use, which is Wi-Fi. Offload's playing a large role in the 4G market now, today, and some think it should play potentially an increased role. I wanted to know how you viewed the role of unlicensed spectrum in the 4G market and the FCC's approach.
Well, I think unlicensed use is a critical part of any all-of-the-above approach to spectrum. And I think, as you have discussed earlier today, Wi-Fi offload is just the greatest example of that. I think we take for granted now, most people do, the fact that a Wi-Fi connection in your home can enable you to have a connection to the internet. And I am very optimistic that we can establish even more robust opportunities for unlicensed use. One of the things I'm especially keen on doing is having the FCC commence a proceeding to get 200 megahertz of spectrum available for unlicensed use in the 5 gigahertz band. From what I've heard and read and seen, the 5 gigahertz band is especially well suited for unlicensed purposes, in terms of the propagation characteristics and those kinds of things. So I'm hopeful that my colleagues and I, working together, can try to get more unlicensed opportunities out there into the market.
Very interesting, very interesting. Well, there's another way to get spectrum that I think may have been mentioned earlier, which is the secondary markets, which have a role to play when there are those who aren't using their spectrum and would like to sell it to someone else. There's been some uncertainty around this. There's regulatory, the first keynote speaker talked about the potential for regulatory delays and uncertainty, and the FCC started a proceeding on the issue. I know you can't get too specific, but I wanted to know what you thought about that proceeding regarding secondary market spectrum transactions.
Well, I think there are a number of problems with the Commission's current approach to spectrum aggregation. For one thing, I think our current measures consistently understate the amount of competition in the marketplace. That happens because we exclude certain spectrum that is in fact being used today for wireless services. Just to give you one example, the BRS and EBS spectrum that is currently being used by Clearwire for 4G service is not included in our tally. And so by reducing the denominator, if you will, we necessarily understate the amount of competition in the marketplace. The other problem with our current approach is that it needlessly creates regulatory uncertainty. When wireless providers are thinking about engaging in a secondary market transaction, they want to be focused on the merits of the transaction, but they also have to incorporate into their thinking a significant question. What is the FCC going to do with this transaction? How are they going to view our spectrum holdings? The problem is they just don't know, ex ante at least, how the Commission is going to come out. And that kind of uncertainty can delay or even deter altogether what otherwise would be a welfare maximizing secondary market transaction when it comes to spectrum. And so I'm a little hopeful that the Commission would reevaluate its approach. To be honest, though, I'm also a bit concerned about the direction the Commission might take based on the notice of proposed rulemaking that you identified. The reason I say that is because there are a number of proposals within the notice that might unduly limit the efficient working of the secondary market. For example, some of the proposals in the NPRM would allow the FCC to set an artificially low cap on how much spectrum a company could hold. There are also proposals within the notice that would allow the FCC to effectively second-guess the technical decisions that are made by wireless companies in order to discern whether they are indeed making the most efficient use of the spectrum they already hold. Those are the types of questions that I think the FCC shouldn't do, both because we might not have the technical expertise to do so, but more importantly, because as a policy matter, we should be focused on allowing the secondary market to operate efficiently. Reviewing the transaction for any competitive harms, of course, but otherwise stepping back and letting the market work its magic.
Well, I realize you probably can't say anything specific about two large pending transactions, T-Mobile Metro PCS and the Sprint SoftBank transaction, but other than just the spectrum issue, I wondered if there were any sort of general views you had about the way these secondary market transactions should be handled, other than the spectrum aggregation piece that you just spoke about, or maybe elaborating on that.
Well, as you suggested, I can't comment on the merits of those particular transactions, but what I can tell you is my own view of the transactional review process. One thing I think that we should do is codify in our rules the 180-day shot clock. It's a worthy goal, and I think it is vital for us to act with dispatch, in these cases. One way to do that is to enshrine in our rules that the Commission has to act within 180 days. Another thing that I think we should do in these transactions, and any transaction for that matter, is limit ourselves to identification and, if necessary, amelioration of transaction-specific harms. I think part of the problem of what you've seen of late in the context of FCC transactional review is that the review process becomes a vortex, if you will, in which a whole bunch of extraneous concerns, which might be good as a matter of public policy, are nonetheless unrelated to the transaction and are sought to be resolved within the context of the transaction. My view is that those types of concerns should be addressed within the context of an industry-wide rulemaking rather than a specific adjudication involving two parties who are seeking to engage in a transaction. So those are some of the principles that I would apply when it comes to transactional review. And I think that if we did things in a timely fashion, if we stuck to just the facts, just the transaction, I think you would see a lot more, again, welfare maximizing transactions taking place in the market.
I think do I have time for one more, Burge? Okay, one more, and then we're out of time. But I think this is an important one because we've been so focused on the spectrum issues and the infrastructure and the like. But the 4G ecosystem is much broader than that. Consumers rave about applications, devices. They crave them. They're a critical element of this 4G world that we're talking about, and have traditionally been lightly regulated by the FCC. So the last question is, do you think that there may be an FCC role in ensuring these segments continue to grow and thrive?
I do. I think part of the thing we need to keep in mind is the historic approach that Congress and the FCC have taken to the wireless market. As you know, in 1993, a fundamental decision was made to have a light touch when it comes to regulation of the wireless market. And I think over the last 2 decades, what any observer would agree is that some of the greatest innovation in terms of consumer applications has come in the wireless market. And I think part of the reason is that the private sector has been allowed to thrive without the government stepping in with heavy-handed regulations. And I think it is useful to think about it as a comparison of the wireline side. On the wireline side, as you know, there is a long history of common carrier regulation enshrined in Title II of the Communications Act. And that common carrier regulation was premised on copper wire networks, which were run by monopolies and over which simple voice service was provided. We had no other choice, and so the government stepped in to regulate everything from the prices to terms and conditions of use. But on the wireless side, I think what we see, especially as we transition into an all IP infrastructure, is the fact that FCC regulation really doesn't have, of the type I'm talking about, common carrier regulation, doesn't have the same application to next generation IP-based mobile services. And I think we would do well at the Commission to think about these networks and to think about wireless services generally in a more progressive way, by allowing the IP transition to proceed quicker, and by not applying some of those common carrier regulations to the wireless market. And I think if we do that, you're going to see not just greater deployment of wireless infrastructure, but you're going to see much more development in terms of the applications that ride over that infrastructure. Because I think if application developers have the confidence that the FCC and other federal regulators can solve the spectrum problem and remove barriers to infrastructure investment, they're going to feel like the sky's the limit in terms of what they can put out there for consumers to adopt. And so I'm optimistic that we can do it if we have a 21st century view in mind.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it back over to Burge, and I've seen those trees just whipping around, so I also want to wish you and your family well back in the D.C. area, and hope that everything goes okay with the hurricane.
Well, Well, thank you very much, and I certainly hope not to be calling upon any of you for branch removal in the near future.
Okay, thanks. Persh?
Thank you so much.